The bitter irony struck Oberleutnant Karl Müller like a physical blow as he gazed across the lush farmland surrounding Camp Hearn in east-central Texas. His stomach was full from a breakfast of eggs, bacon, fresh bread, and real coffee. Luxuries unimaginable in the bomb-ravaged cities of the Reich. The sun shone warm on his face as he watched fellow German prisoners play soccer on a well-maintained field. "This cannot be prison," he wrote in his journal that evening in May 1944. "My men are healthier and better fed here than they would be fighting on the Russian front. Some have gained 10 kilos since arrival. The terrible truth is becoming clear to us all. We live better as America's prisoners than our own families do in Germany." Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The paradox of German prisoners of war experiencing better living conditions in American captivity than in their homeland represents one of the most psychologically complex chapters of World War II. Between 1943 and 1946, nearly 380,000 German POWs were transported across the Atlantic to the United States, with Texas housing more prisoners than any other state, approximately 50,000 men in 24 main camps and numerous smaller branch facilities. For many of these prisoners, the revelation that came with their comfortable captivity constituted a profound psychological turning point, the moment they truly understood that Germany had lost the war. The Texas POW story begins not on American soil, but in the scorching deserts of North Africa. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa in November 1942, followed by the Tunisia campaign, delivered the first massive haul of German prisoners. The vaunted Afrika Korps, once the pride of Hitler's war machine under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, surrendered en masse in May 1943. Over 130,000 Axis troops, including nearly 40,000 Germans, laid down their arms. These soldiers, many of them young, fanatically devoted to Hitler, and convinced of Germany's inevitable victory, would become the first large contingent transported to American shores. Lieutenant Colonel Erwin Weber of the 15th Panzer Division later recalled the shock of capture. "We believed ourselves invincible. Even as fuel and supplies dwindled, we maintained our faith in the Führer's promise that we would never be abandoned. When surrender came, we expected the worst, perhaps execution, certainly harsh treatment. We had been told Americans were soft but barbaric. What awaited us instead would shake the foundations of everything we had been taught." The decision to bring German prisoners to America was driven by practical considerations. Britain, already straining under wartime shortages and vulnerable to air raids, could not safely house hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners. America, with its vast interior spaces far from the front lines, its abundant food supply, and its acute labor shortage as millions of men went off to war, provided the logical solution. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which both the United States and Germany had signed, established detailed protocols for the treatment of prisoners of war. It mandated that captured troops receive the same quality of food, housing, and medical care as the capturing nation's own military personnel. For the American military establishment, following these guidelines was not merely a moral obligation, but a strategic calculation. Proper treatment of German POWs might encourage reciprocal treatment of American soldiers in German hands. What few anticipated was how this humanitarian approach would evolve into a powerful psychological weapon. As historian Arnold Kramer noted, the American POW program unwittingly became one of the most effective forms of psychological warfare in the American arsenal. The journey to American captivity began with long transatlantic voyages aboard converted luxury liners and troop transport ships. Many prisoners, having endured the deprivations of the North African campaign or the collapse of front lines in Europe, already noticed a stark contrast in treatment. Wilhelm Gunther, captured at Tunis in 1943, described his transport experience in a letter smuggled to his family. "We are fed 3 times daily. Real meat, potatoes, vegetables. The Americans waste more food than we've seen in months on the front." Some of our men have begun to ask dangerous questions about what we've been told regarding American capabilities. Upon arrival at American ports, typically Boston, New York, or Norfolk, prisoners boarded trains with windows uncovered, a deliberate decision that allowed them to witness America's unbombed cities, humming factories, and abundant farmland. This sightseeing tour, as military officials sometimes called it, delivered the first psychological blow to Nazi indoctrination about American weakness and inefficiency. For German soldiers who had been told that American cities lay in ruins from German U-boat blockades and that the U.S. economy teetered on collapse, the view from those train windows constituted a shock that many recorded in diaries and letters. Feldwebel Hans Geller, transported to Camp Swift in Texas, wrote, "Mile after mile of prosperity, factory chimneys belching smoke, endless fields of crops, automobiles everywhere despite what our propaganda claimed about America's oil shortage. It was like traveling through a fantasy land untouched by war." Texas received a disproportionate share of German prisoners for several reasons. Its climate resembled North Africa, where many early prisoners had been captured. Its vast agricultural regions faced critical labor shortages, and its remote location minimized escape risks while offering abundant space for large facilities. 3 of the largest camps, Camp Hearn in east central Texas, Camp Swift near Austin, and Camp Hood, now Fort Hood, in central Texas, each housed thousands of prisoners. When German POWs arrived at these Texas camps, they encountered conditions that would further challenge their worldview. Barracks, while basic, were clean, weatherproof, and equipped with heating and plumbing. Food was abundant, 3 meals daily that, while simple, contained meat, dairy, vegetables, and portions that seemed luxurious compared to rations in the German military. Medical care was prompt and professional. Recreational facilities included athletic fields, theaters, and libraries. Camp Hearn, which housed approximately 4,800 prisoners at its peak, exemplified the standard American approach. Located amid the cotton fields of Robertson County, the camp featured barracks organized into compounds of 1,800 men each. Prisoners established orchestras, theater groups, and sports teams. They built a swimming pool using primitive tools and ingenuity. They received educational materials through the International Red Cross and organized classes in English, mathematics, and various academic subjects. Most surprising to many prisoners was the implementation of the Geneva Convention's labor provisions. The convention permitted detaining powers to utilize prisoner labor, excluding officers, in non-dangerous, non-military work, provided they received payment. In Texas, this translated to agricultural work that addressed critical wartime labor shortages while giving prisoners purpose, exercise, and spending money. Lieutenant Kurt Pechman, who supervised work details at Camp Swift, described the system in his post-war memoir. "We received 80 cents per day for agricultural work, picking cotton, harvesting vegetables, clearing fields. The money went to camp canteens where we could purchase additional food, cigarettes, personal items, even beer." Some men sent earnings home through the Red Cross. The Americans had created a miniature economy behind barbed wire. Local farmers initially viewed German prisoners with suspicion and hostility. Many had sons fighting in Europe against these same men. However, economic necessity and daily interaction gradually softened attitudes. Martha Stringham, who employed POW labor on her family's cotton farm near Hearn, recalled in a 1977 interview, "At first, I couldn't look at them without thinking of my boy fighting over there. But they were just young men, polite, hard-working, often homesick. One showed me pictures of his children, another had been a schoolteacher before the war. By harvest's end, I was sending them home with extra food and treating them like any other farmhands." This humane treatment served multiple purposes beyond Geneva Convention compliance. Military authorities recognized that content prisoners caused fewer discipline problems. Productive labor addressed civilian workforce shortages. And perhaps most importantly, the contrast between American abundance and reported conditions in Germany created a powerful psychological effect. For many prisoners, the breaking point in their ideological devotion came not from American propaganda, but from letters from home describing increasing hardships as Allied bombing devastated German cities and infrastructure. Johannes Weber, interned at Camp Hood, recorded in his diary in December 1944. Letter from Hanover today. Mother writes that they have electricity only 2 hours daily. Bread is now mixed with sawdust. My sister lost her home in the bombing last month and sleeps with her children in a public shelter. Meanwhile, I had roast beef for Christmas dinner and watched a Hollywood film in the camp theater. The Reich is losing on all fronts while I grow fat in Texas. What madness this war has become. The American intelligence services recognize the potential in this growing disillusionment. Beginning in mid-1944, the military initiated a careful re-education program aimed at exposing prisoners to democratic values while countering Nazi indoctrination. Unlike heavy-handed propaganda, this intellectual diversion program, as officials termed it, relied on voluntary participation in discussion groups, democracy-oriented classes, and access to uncensored news about Germany's deteriorating situation. At Camp Herne, a special projects division established a camp newspaper called Der Wächter, the Guardian, that presented war news from neutral Swiss and Swedish sources. Film screenings included documentaries about American life alongside footage of liberated concentration camps that revealed Nazi atrocities many prisoners had not known about or had dismissed as propaganda. Educational courses offered perspectives on democratic governance and German cultural achievements separate from Nazi ideology. The impact varied among prisoner populations. Those captured earlier in the war, particularly Afrika Korps veterans who had experienced the full force of Nazi indoctrination, often maintained stronger resistance to American influence. Men captured in the later stages of the European campaign, especially after D-Day, frequently arrived already disillusioned with Hitler's leadership and more receptive to alternative viewpoints. Camp societies developed complex internal hierarchies that reflected these divisions. Ardent Nazis sometimes attempted to maintain ideological control through intimidation. Several camps, including Herne, experienced incidents where suspected traitors were subjected to informal trials and harsh punishments by Nazi loyalists. In the most extreme case at Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, a German prisoner believed to be cooperating with Americans was murdered by fellow POWs. American authorities responded by segregating prisoners based on political reliability. Those identified as anti-Nazi were transferred to separate facilities, while confirmed Nazi hardliners were concentrated in specialized camps with stricter security measures. This segregation protected democratic-leaning prisoners while allowing tailored re-education approaches for different groups. Captain Friedrich Neumann, who served as spokesman for his compound at Camp Swift, described this evolving social dynamic. By mid-1944, most men could be divided into three groups. The diminishing number of Hitler loyalists who insisted victory remained possible. The growing majority who accepted Germany's defeat as inevitable, but maintained pride in German identity separate from Nazism. And a smaller group embracing American democratic principles with enthusiasm. The interactions between these factions produced intense debates about Germany's future and personal responsibility for the war. Local Texans, meanwhile, developed increasingly nuanced relationships with the prisoners in their midst. Initial fears of Nazi supermen or dangerous saboteurs gave way to more practical assessments as daily interactions humanized the enemy. Farmers praised the Germans' work ethic. Townspeople encountered prisoners on supervised visits to local businesses. Some communities even came to view their Germans with a sense of proprietary interest that occasionally alarmed military authorities. Ernst Johansson, assigned to agricultural work near Huntsville, recalled, "The farmer's wife would pack extra sandwiches in our lunch. Their daughter taught us American expressions. When I mentioned I had trained as a mechanic, the farmer brought me a broken tractor part and asked if I could repair it. For a few hours working on that engine, I forgot I was a prisoner at all. These positive civilian interactions contradicted much of what prisoners had been taught about Americans. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as either decadent weaklings or bloodthirsty gangsters influenced by their Jewish and black populations. The reality of hard-working, church-going, predominantly white rural Texans challenged these stereotypes and created cognitive dissonance that further undermined Nazi ideology. The ultimate psychological blow for many prisoners came through the contrast between their comfortable captivity and the increasingly desperate letters from Germany. As Allied bombing intensified throughout 1944 and early 1945, prisoners received accounts of food shortages, civilian deaths, and infrastructure collapse that made their own circumstances seem luxurious by comparison. Walter Schmidt, held at Camp Hearn, wrote in February 1945, "My wife's last letter describes using furniture as firewood. My parents were bombed out in Dresden. The children receive 1 egg per month. Meanwhile, I played soccer yesterday, ate an orange, my 3rd this week, and am rehearsing for a camp theatrical production. The guilt becomes unbearable. We sit in comfort while our families suffer, and for what cause? A war that was lost the moment America entered it, though we could not see this truth then." As Germany's collapse accelerated in early 1945, a final wave of prisoners arrived in Texas, many captured during the Battle of the Bulge. These men, often teenagers or middle-aged conscripts from the Volkssturm, People's Militia, brought first-hand accounts of Germany's desperate situation that confirmed what earlier prisoners had begun to suspect. The Third Reich was crumbling from within, even as its territory shrank under Allied advances. News of Hitler's suicide on April 30, 1945, and Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8 reached Texas camps via radio broadcasts and newspaper announcements. Military authorities carefully monitored prisoner reactions, which ranged from stoic acceptance to open relief. At Camp Swift, prisoners requested a special church service to mark the war's end. At Camp Hearn, a prisoner orchestra performed a somber concert featuring German classical music. At Camp Hood, a diarist recorded simply, "It is over. Now we must live with what comes next." The psychological journey from capture to acceptance of defeat varied tremendously among individuals. For some, like Feldwebel Marcus Schneider at Camp Hearn, the revelation came early. After 3 weeks in Texas, seeing America's strength firsthand, I knew Germany could not win. The factories, the food, the endless resources, we were told America was weak, but I saw an industrial giant awakened and angry. My only surprise is that the war continued so long after this became obvious. For others, particularly those steeped in Nazi ideology from youth, acceptance came harder. Werner Baumann, a Hitler youth leader before joining the Wehrmacht, maintained his faith in ultimate German victory until the very end. Even as the Americans showed us newspaper photos of Berlin in ruins, I insisted it was propaganda. Only when letters from my own family confirmed everything did my worldview finally shatter. I had built my entire identity on beliefs that proved completely false. The Texas heat bore down mercilessly as summer approached in 1945. In the POW compounds across the state, men who had once fought for the Third Reich now contemplated a future in a world where that regime had been utterly defeated. For many, the strange comfort of their captivity had become the first chapter in a profound transformation, from soldiers of Hitler to witnesses of Germany's calamitous failure, and eventually to participants in its democratic rebirth. As Hauptmann Wilhelm Kreider wrote from Camp Hearn in what would be one of his final diary entries before repatriation, "The greatest defeat was not military but moral, not the loss of territory, but the loss of certainty. We came to America as convinced soldiers of the Reich, and will return as men haunted by questions. How did we allow ourselves to follow that path? What responsibility do we bear? And how can Germany rebuild from such complete physical and spiritual ruin? Perhaps the greatest irony is that it took American captivity to make us truly free to ask these questions at all. With Germany's surrender, the POW program entered a new phase. The legal justification for holding prisoners, ongoing hostilities, had ended, but practical considerations prevented immediate repatriation. Devastated European infrastructure couldn't absorb hundreds of thousands of returning prisoners. More importantly, Allied authorities needed manpower for reconstruction efforts and remained concerned about releasing potentially unrepentant Nazis into occupied Germany. The solution was a gradual repatriation process combined with expanded re-education efforts. In Texas camps, the curriculum shifted from general exposure to democratic values toward practical preparation for returning to a defeated, occupied homeland. Courses now included information about denazification procedures, occupation regulations, and economic conditions in post-war Germany. The intellectual groundwork laid during captivity would now be tested against the harsh realities of a nation in ruins. As the summer of 1945 gave way to fall, the first groups of prisoners began departing Texas for repatriation processing centers. Priority went to those with needed reconstruction skills, those deemed most thoroughly democratized, and those with urgent family situations. The remaining prisoners continued working in agriculture and other approved industries, their labor still valuable in an American economy transitioning from war to peace. Captain Heinrich Müller, preparing for repatriation from Camp Swift in October 1945, surveyed his footlocker, a Bible, a German-English dictionary, 3 notebooks filled with mathematical formulas from camp classes, a hand-carved chess set, photographs of Texas landscapes, and a small American flag given to him by a farmer's child. "I came with nothing but a uniform," he wrote. "I leave with tools for building a different life." The question remains whether that life is possible in the Germany that awaits us. The first returning prisoners encountered a homeland transformed beyond recognition. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure had collapsed, food shortages approached famine conditions, and millions of displaced persons wandered amid the rubble. Germany was now divided into occupation zones, its sovereignty suspended, its future uncertain. For men who had left the Texas sunshine, regular meals, and ordered camp life, the contrast was devastating. Karl Weber, repatriated to Munich in December 1945, wrote to his former American camp commander, "I finally reached my family after 3 weeks of travel through a landscape from Dante's Inferno. My home exists only as a single standing wall. My wife and children live in a cellar with 3 other families. We receive 1,100 calories daily, half what I ate in Texas. Yesterday I stood 8 hours in line for a loaf of bread. Now I understand fully what we lost when we followed Hitler into madness. My children ask why I am not happy to be home. How can I explain that I lived better as a prisoner than they do as free Germans?" Such testimonials confirmed what American authorities had hoped. The POW experience had created a profound psychological impact that could potentially influence Germany's post-war development. The visible abundance of American society, experienced firsthand, undermined Nazi claims of superiority and offered an alternative vision of prosperity through democratic capitalism. The humane treatment of prisoners demonstrated moral values that contrasted sharply with Nazi brutality. And the intellectual freedom of camp life, even with its limitations, had allowed many men to reconsider their political allegiances. Dr. Maxwell McKnight, who had supervised the Special Projects Division of the POW program, tracked the subsequent careers of former prisoners and found significant patterns. Those who had participated most actively in camp educational programs often emerged as leaders in post-war German reconstruction. Some became advocates for democratic reforms, entered local politics, or joined the civil service in the developing West German government. Others applied technical skills acquired during captivity to Germany's economic resurgence. A small but notable group even emigrated to the United States after restrictions on former enemy aliens were relaxed. For the communities that had hosted POW camps, the departure of the German prisoners created unexpected voids. Local economies had grown dependent on prisoner labor, particularly in agriculture. Cultural connections had formed through church services, permitted interaction during work assignments, and the shared humanity that emerged despite language barriers and wartime hostilities. Horace Williams, who employed POWs on his cotton farm near Camp Hearn, remarked in a local newspaper interview, "Strange to say it, but we miss those boys. They worked hard, never complained, taught us German songs while picking cotton. Horace fixed our tractor better than any mechanic in town. Friedrich knew more about crop rotation than I did after 40 years farming. My wife still bakes extra cookies on Sundays out of habit, forgetting they're gone." Some Texas communities maintained these connections long after the war. Former prisoners wrote letters to American families who had shown them kindness. A few returned as tourists or immigrants in later decades. Farmer Everett Wilson of Huntsville hosted his former prisoner farmhand, now a prosperous engineer, in 1962. 17 years ago, he picked my tomatoes as a POW, Wilson told the Huntsville item. Now he's visiting with his American-made car and taking pictures of his children standing where he once worked under guard. If that isn't a story about how the world can change, I don't know what is. The camps themselves quickly disappeared from the Texas landscape. Military necessity had dictated their hasty construction. Post-war practicality demanded their rapid dismantling. Buildings were sold for scrap lumber or repurposed for civilian use. Camp Hearn's hospital became a community medical center. Camp Swift's facilities were partially incorporated into the University of Texas. At Camp Hood, POW compounds gave way to expanded training areas for the permanent military installation. By 1947, most physical evidence of the POW program had vanished. What remained were memories, relationships, and the invisible imprint of an experience that had transformed both captives and captors. The Texas POW story became a footnote in most military histories, overshadowed by combat operations and geopolitical developments. Yet for those who lived through it, the significance was profound and lasting. The broader impact on Germany's post-war development, while impossible to quantify precisely, appears significant in historical perspective. The approximately 380,000 German prisoners who experienced American captivity, roughly 5% of all surviving German military personnel, constituted an influential cohort in post-war society. Many returned with first-hand knowledge of American democracy, industrial capacity, and living standards that contradicted Nazi propaganda. They had witnessed racial integration in the U.S. military that challenged Nazi racial theories. And perhaps most importantly, they had experienced treatment that respected their human dignity despite their status as enemy combatants. Historian Ron Robin, studying the long-term effects of the POW program, concluded, "While not all former prisoners embraced democratic values, their exposure to American society created a reservoir of goodwill and understanding that facilitated Germany's eventual integration into Western democratic structures." The POW experience represented a form of grassroots diplomacy that complemented formal occupation policies and Marshall Plan economic assistance. This diplomatic dimension became increasingly valuable as Cold War tensions divided Germany between Western and Soviet spheres of influence. Former prisoners who had experienced American captivity often provided a counter-narrative to Soviet propaganda in the emerging ideological battlefield. Their testimonials about material abundance and political freedom in the United States contrasted sharply with reports of harsh treatment in Soviet POW camps, reinforcing West Germany's cultural and political alignment with the Western Bloc. Feldwebel Werner Braun, who returned to what became East Germany, maintained secret correspondence with American contacts until the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. In a letter smuggled out in 1964, he wrote, Our official newspapers claim Americans live in poverty and fear. I say nothing, but remember the farm in Texas where I worked, the machinery, the food, the farmers' 2 automobiles. When my neighbors complain about shortages, I think of American supermarkets I glimpsed during a supervised visit to Bryan, Texas. These memories sustain me through the lies we must pretend to believe. The Texas POW experience illustrates a paradox of warfare. Sometimes the most effective weapons are not those that destroy, but those that build. The American decision to treat German prisoners humanely according to Geneva Convention standards, while motivated by legal obligations, reciprocity concerns, and practical considerations, yielded unexpected strategic benefits. The contrast between POW living conditions and the collapsing Third Reich delivered a psychological blow more devastating than any bombing raid. It undermined the ideological foundations of Nazism by demonstrating American strength, abundance, and values through direct personal experience rather than propaganda. This psychological impact operated on multiple levels. At the most basic, prisoners experienced material comfort that contradicted claims of American weakness. Wilhelm Mueller, captured in North Africa and held at Camp Swift, described this dimension. We had been told Americans were soft, inefficient, their economy collapsing under war demands. Yet here was a nation that could feed, house, and guard hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers while simultaneously fighting a 2-front war and supplying its allies. The abundance was undeniable, visible in everything from the guards' uniforms to the food on our plates. At a deeper level, prisoners encountered an American society that functioned according to principles diametrically opposed to Nazi ideology. Rule of law replaced arbitrary power. Individual rights superseded state authority. Ethnic and religious diversity coexisted with national identity. These observations challenged the fundamental Nazi worldview more effectively than any counter-propaganda could have done. Kurt Langenheim, a former Hitler youth leader held at Camp Hearn, described his psychological journey. I arrived convinced that only strength mattered, that democracy was weakness, that racial purity determined national destiny. I departed questioning every certainty. If America was weak, why did they have the resources to treat prisoners so well? If democracy was inefficient, how had they outproduced the Reich? If their racial mixing was fatal, why was their society functioning while ours collapsed? The questions themselves were dangerous to everything I had believed. Perhaps most importantly, humane treatment demonstrated moral authority that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the Nazi regime. As news of concentration camps and other atrocities emerged, many prisoners experienced profound shame and moral reevaluation. The American example offered not just a repudiation of Nazism, but a positive alternative, a society that could be powerful without being cruel, unified without being totalitarian, patriotic without being genocidal. This moral dimension proved especially significant as prisoners contemplated Germany's post-war future. Those who had experienced American captivity could envision a Germany rebuilt on democratic principles because they had seen such principles in action, however imperfectly. Their first-hand experience provided a practical template that abstract democratic theory alone could not offer. The distinctive Texas environment added unique elements to this transformative experience. The state's vast landscapes, so different from Germany's dense population centers, inspired reflection and perspective. The particular blend of individualism, religiosity, and frontier mythology that characterized Texas culture offered an American identity distinct from the urban, industrial Northeast that German propaganda had typically portrayed. Erich Lautenschlager, who worked on a cotton farm near Huntsville, captured this dimension. In Texas, I met Americans unlike any we had been told about, not gangsters or plutocrats, but farmers who worked alongside us in the fields. Deeply religious people who invited us to their churches despite our enemy status, families who showed us photographs of sons fighting in Europe, perhaps against our own units, yet treated us with rough dignity. This complex humanity made me question the caricatures we had accepted. The Texas climate itself became a powerful memory marker. The intense summer heat, so foreign to German experience, created a sensory impression that linked prisoners' psychological transformations to physical discomfort. Winter months, mild by German standards, offered respite that contrasted with the brutal Eastern Front, where many had fought. These climatic extremes became metaphors for the emotional journey from capture to acceptance, resistance to adaptation. As the final prisoners departed Texas in 1946, they left behind physical and cultural imprints that would long outlast their presence. Improvements they had made to camp facilities, swimming pools, soccer fields, gardens, theatrical stages remained as curious artifacts until demolition. Artwork they created adorned local homes and businesses. Engineering projects they completed on area farms continued functioning for decades. German words and phrases entered local vocabulary. Recipes and cooking techniques influenced regional cuisine in subtle ways. More significantly, they left changed communities with expanded worldviews. For many rural Texans, German prisoners represented the first foreigners they had encountered directly. These interactions humanized the distant war and complicated simplistic propaganda from both sides. Farmers who worked alongside prisoners gained respect for German technical knowledge and work ethic. Families who observed prisoners at church services or community events recognized shared human experiences across enemy lines. Dorothy Henderson, who taught English to prisoners at Camp Swift through a YMCA program, reflected in a 1980 oral history interview, "Before the Germans came, our town was isolated, provincial. The war was something happening in newsreels. Then suddenly, we had hundreds of young men from another continent in our midst. They knew languages, music, literature we'd never encountered. They asked questions about America that made us see our own country differently. When they left, our community had larger perspectives. We'd become part of world history in a small but meaningful way." For the prisoners themselves, the Texas chapter remained vivid decades later. Veterans organizations of former POWs held reunions where Texas experiences featured prominently in shared memories. Memoirs and oral histories consistently identified the American captivity period as transformative. The peculiar combination of physical restriction and intellectual freedom, material comfort and emotional hardship, enemy status and human connection, created a unique space for personal reevaluation that many described as life-changing. Otto Engelhardt, who spent 2 years at Camp Hearn, summarized this paradox in a 1975 interview. "I was never so free as when I was a prisoner in Texas. Free from Nazi supervision that had governed every aspect of military life. Free from the terror of combat and the guilt of what Germany was doing. Free to read books banned in the Reich, to speak openly with other prisoners about our doubts, to reconsider everything we had been taught. The barbed wire around us created a space where our minds could expand beyond the narrow ideology we had accepted." This testimony highlights the central irony embedded in the article's title. For many German POWs, physical captivity in Texas offered forms of freedom, intellectual, psychological, moral, unavailable in Nazi Germany. Their improved physical conditions compared to the deteriorating situation in the homeland represented merely the most visible dimension of this paradox. The deeper reality was that America's enemy prison camps, with all their restrictions, provided greater human dignity and personal autonomy than Hitler's free society with its totalitarian control. As Germany rebuilt in the post-war years, this lived experience of alternatives to authoritarianism influenced the development of democratic institutions, particularly in West Germany. Former prisoners who had witnessed American democracy, however imperfectly implemented, could envision its application in German context. Those who had experienced rule of law in captivity could contribute to establishing similar principles in civilian governance. Men who had managed their own camp communities under American supervision had practiced forms of self-government that prepared them for democratic participation. The long-term success of West Germany's democratic transition, in contrast to many failed democratic experiments throughout history, suggests that these grassroots experiences complemented top-down occupation policies and constitutional reforms. Democracy took root partly because enough Germans had seen it function and could imagine themselves participating in it. The POW program, while never designed primarily as a democracy promotion initiative, contributed significantly to this outcome. In historical perspective, the Texas POW story illustrates broader patterns in how ideological transformations occur. Direct experience proves more persuasive than propaganda. Material realities speak louder than abstract theories. Humane treatment builds moral authority more effectively than coercion. And individuals reconsider their worldviews not primarily through formal education, but through the accumulation of observations and experiences that contradict previous certainties. The timing of this German encounter with America, at precisely the moment when Germany faced comprehensive defeat and ideological collapse, magnified its impact. Prisoners experienced American society when most receptive to alternatives to Nazism. They witnessed American power at its zenith, creating an indelible impression of capabilities that Nazi propaganda had systematically underestimated, and they returned to a Germany seeking new foundations for national identity and governance after total political, military, and moral failure. Hans Gertner, repatriated from Camp Herne to Munich in early 1946, described this convergence. "I returned to a nation of ruins, physical ruins of bombed cities, political ruins of a collapsed regime, moral ruins of exposed atrocities, psychological ruins of shattered certainties. Everything required rebuilding from foundations upward. In this vacuum, my American experience provided at least some reference point for what might replace what was lost. Not to create an American Germany, which was neither possible nor desirable, but to adapt applicable principles to our own situation and needs." This adaptive approach characterized Germany's post-war reconstruction more broadly. Rather than simply importing American models wholesale, Germans synthesized democratic principles with their own cultural traditions and historical circumstances. The resulting social market economy and federal parliamentary system represented neither pure American capitalism nor traditional German statism, but a distinctive hybrid that drew from multiple influences while addressing specific German conditions. Former prisoners, with their direct exposure to American society, often served as translators of democratic concepts into German contexts. Their credibility stemmed not from theoretical expertise, but from lived experience that allowed them to distinguish between universal principles and culturally specific implementations. They could advocate democracy without appearing to advocate simple Americanization, a critical distinction in a nation rebuilding its identity after defeat. The Texas POW camps thus functioned as unintended laboratories for post-war reconstruction, spaces where German soldiers could observe alternative social and political arrangements while beginning to process their nation's catastrophic failure. Camp newspapers, educational programs, and supervised interactions with civilian society provided intellectual frameworks for understanding these alternatives. The stark contrast between camp conditions and the deteriorating homeland delivered emotional impact that intellectual arguments alone could not achieve. Dr. Jeffrey Littlejohn, historian at Sam Houston State University, who has extensively documented the Texas POW experience, summarizes this dynamic. These camps serve simultaneously as confinement facilities, agricultural labor pools, re-education centers, and cultural exchange programs. Their effectiveness stemmed not from any single dimension, but from the interaction of all these functions. Prisoners worked alongside Americans, observed democratic practices in camp governance, received uncensored information about the war and Nazi atrocities, and experienced material conditions that contradicted Nazi propaganda. This multifaceted exposure proved more transformative than any formal indoctrination program could have been. The transformation extended beyond political ideology to encompass broader cultural and personal dimensions. Former prisoners frequently reported changed attitudes toward race relations, religious diversity, consumer culture, gender roles, and international cooperation. While not all changes aligned with progressive values, many prisoners maintained conservative social views compatible with aspects of Nazi ideology, even as they rejected its racial theories and totalitarianism. The overall effect was opening minds previously constrained by Nazi orthodoxy. Walter Schroeder, who worked on a farm near Camp Swift with a diverse labor force, described one such shift. On that Texas farm, I worked beside a black American overseer who knew more about agriculture than anyone I'd met. This contradicted everything we had been taught about racial hierarchy. Later, I worked with a Mexican-American family who invited me to share meals despite my prisoner status. Their kindness challenged my notions of national and ethnic divisions. I returned to Germany questioning categories I had previously accepted without thought. As the Cold War intensified in the late 1940s and early 1950s, these attitudinal changes acquired strategic significance. West Germany's integration into NATO and alignment with American security policies built partly on foundations laid by the POW experience. Former prisoners who had observed American military capabilities firsthand often became advocates for Western alignment, understanding from personal experience the futility of opposing American power. Those who had developed nuanced views of American society could counteract Soviet propaganda portraying the United States as purely imperialistic or exploitative. Werner Klein, who rose to a mid-level position in West Germany's defense ministry after captivity at Camp Hood, explained this connection. My American captivity convinced me of two realities. First, that American military-industrial capacity made them unbeatable in conventional warfare. Second, that despite this power, they generally used it with restraint and within legal frameworks. Both lessons informed my professional judgment that Germany's security interests aligned with America's, not because we shared all values or interests, but because they offered the best protection with the least domination. The Texas POW camps thus produced an unexpected legacy, a cohort of Germans with personal connections to America who could serve as cultural bridges during the critical early Cold War period when West Germany's orientation remained uncertain. Their influence extended beyond formal politics into civil society, business relationships, educational exchanges, and other domains where U.S.-German cooperation developed during the 1950s and beyond. This legacy was not without complications and contradictions. Former prisoners varied tremendously in how they processed their captivity experiences. Some embraced democratic values wholeheartedly. Others adopted more superficial changes while maintaining authoritarian tendencies. A minority remained hostile to American influence despite, or perhaps because of, their captivity. The relationship between POW experiences and subsequent political development followed no simple pattern. Helmut Wagner, interned at Camp Hearn and later a journalist in West Germany, captured this complexity. Some of the most dedicated Nazis I knew became enthusiastic Democrats after witnessing American power. Some anti-Nazi prisoners grew disillusioned with American materialism and developed neo-nationalist views. Others compartmentalized their experiences, separating what they admired about America from what they rejected. Few of us integrated our captivity experiences in identical ways because we brought different histories to them and returned to different circumstances. Perhaps the most meaningful legacy emerged not in grand political transformations, but in countless small human connections that transcended wartime divisions. Former prisoners who maintained correspondence with Texas families, farmers who remembered their Germans with surprising fondness, communities that incorporated elements of German culture introduced by prisoners. These personal relationships complicated simplistic narratives of enmity and created grassroots connections between former adversaries. Carl Fuchs, who worked on a peach farm near Fredericksburg, Texas, maintained contact with the Bauer family until his death in 1987. His son, visiting the farm in 2000, found photographs of his father still displayed in the family home. "My father came as an enemy soldier and became almost family," he remarked. This transformation from hatred to connection represents the true victory over Nazism, not just military defeat, but human reconciliation. The material remains of the Texas POW experience have largely vanished. Camp Hearn operates a small museum with reconstructed barracks. Archaeological excavations at former campsites occasionally uncover artifacts, handmade items, modified camp materials, personal effects that provide tangible connections to this history. A few buildings repurposed from camps still stand, though most have been demolished or decayed beyond recognition. What survives more vividly are the stories transmitted through memoirs, oral histories, letters, and family recollections. These narratives consistently emphasize the paradox identified in our title, that German POWs recognized their nation's defeat most clearly through the contrast between their own comfortable captivity and Germany's increasing devastation. Their relatively privileged position as prisoners in a land of plenty while their homeland suffered became a powerful metaphor for the war's futility and the bankruptcy of Nazi promises. Otto Richter, captured in Normandy and held at Camp Swift, articulated this realization. In February 1945, I received a letter from my sister describing how she boiled wallpaper to extract the paste for food. That same day, I had eggs for breakfast and played basketball in the Texas sunshine. This obscene contrast revealed the madness of our leadership more clearly than any propaganda could have done. What kind of war puts prisoners in better circumstances than civilians? What kind of government allows its people to starve while foreign captives eat well? These questions destroyed my remaining faith in the cause we had fought for. For the United States, the POW program represented a strategic success that extended beyond its immediate military purposes. At minimal cost, America had demonstrated both power and principle, the capacity to house and feed hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers while simultaneously fighting a global war, and the commitment to humanitarian treatment that distinguished American democracy from Nazi tyranny. This moral contrast became a powerful weapon in the ideological battles that followed military victory. The humane treatment of German POWs aligned with America's post-war objectives, establishing moral authority in occupied Germany, promoting democratic values, and rehabilitating former enemies as potential Cold War allies. While not every aspect of the program succeeded, some prisoners remained committed Nazis despite re-education efforts, and others developed anti-American sentiments during captivity. The overall impact supported America's transition from wartime adversary to post-war protector in the German public consciousness. Military historian Stephen Ambrose assessed this outcome. The POW program ranks among the most successful aspects of America's World War II effort, not because it achieved perfect results, no program involving hundreds of thousands of people could, but because it advanced multiple strategic objectives simultaneously, adhering to legal obligations, encouraging reciprocity for American POWs, obtaining needed labor, preventing security threats, and laying groundwork for post-war reconstruction. That it accomplished these goals while maintaining humanitarian standards represents a significant achievement. The Texas dimension of this program added distinctive elements that enhanced its effectiveness. The state's agricultural economy provided meaningful work that benefited both prisoners and the war effort. Its diverse geography offered settings from East Texas, piney woods, to hill country German enclaves, to high plains cotton fields, exposing prisoners to America's environmental variety. Its frontier heritage and independent character presented an American identity different from urban industrial centers, complicating prisoners' preconceptions. Most importantly, Texas communities engaged with prisoners in ways that humanized the captivity experience while maintaining security requirements. Local farmers who employed prisoner labor, churches that welcomed prisoners to services, families who developed relationships with work details. These interactions created the human connections that often proved more transformative than formal re-education programs. The resulting grassroots diplomacy laid foundations for reconciliation that official policies alone could not have achieved. As the last former POWs reached the end of their lives in the 2020s, their Texas experiences remain vivid in final testimonies. Wilhelm Müller, interviewed at age 97 in a Munich retirement home, still recalled specific details of the Camp Hearn swimming pool he helped build, the Texas thunderstorms that reminded him of artillery barrages, and the farm family that sent him a Christmas card every year until 1989. Texas changed me, he reflected. I arrived a soldier of Hitler and departed a man who questioned everything I had been taught. That transformation saved my soul, though I did not recognize this until many years later. This transformative impact represents the ultimate paradox of the Texas POW experience, that enemy captivity became the vehicle for a liberation more profound than physical freedom. Behind barbed wire, German prisoners encountered alternatives to Nazi orthodoxy, opportunities for intellectual exploration, and human connections across enemy lines. They experienced an America different from propaganda caricatures and witnessed abundance that contradicted claims of American weakness. Most crucially, they received treatment that respected their humanity despite their enemy status, a moral example that stood in stark contrast to the regime they had served. When these prisoners returned to a defeated Germany, they carried these experiences into reconstruction efforts, political development, and international relationships. Their influence cannot be precisely measured but appears significant in Germany's successful transition from Nazi dictatorship to stable democracy, an outcome far from inevitable given historical patterns of failed democratic transitions elsewhere. The POW experience provided practical templates for democratic governance, first-hand knowledge of alternatives to authoritarianism, and human connections that facilitated reconciliation between former enemies. The Texas POW story thus illustrates how military victory can be consolidated through strategies that extend beyond battlefield dominance to encompass moral authority, cultural influence, and personal transformation. By treating German prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards rather than Nazi principles, America demonstrated the values it sought to instill in post-war Germany. This consistency between practice and principle created credibility that military power alone could not establish. As Hauptmann Friedrich Weber wrote in his final letter to his former camp commander before repatriation from Camp Swift, "You have conquered not just our nation, but many of our minds, not through indoctrination, which we would have resisted, but through the simple evidence of how your society functions and how you treated us despite our status as enemies." This victory may prove more lasting than any achieved through weapons, for it has planted questions we will carry home to a Germany that must rebuild everything, including its concept of itself. 7 decades later, his prediction appears largely fulfilled. Germany has become one of America's closest allies, a stable democracy, and a leading advocate for international humanitarian standards. While many factors contributed to this outcome, the POW experience played a meaningful role by providing direct exposure to American society for hundreds of thousands of Germans at a pivotal moment of national redefinition. Their testimonies consistently identify the contradictory discovery that grounds our narrative. German POWs knew the war was lost when they lived better in Texas than back home.